same building?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
It's a nice little tight-knit circle we've got there. Okay, so the waiting room is starting to trickle out there.
Good.
So welcome everyone. In case anyone is lost, we are here for Voyage of Mercy with Steve Puleo, who is one of our favorite guest authors and a frequent visitor to Lexington Historical Society. So he is here to speak with us about his latest book, which is about the humanitarian mission from the United States to Ireland during the time of the Great Famine. So a couple of housekeeping rules before we get started. This, as you may have noticed, is a slightly different format from many of our previous programs, is that we are in a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar, because we want this to be a conversation. We're all a bit tired of talking heads, and so we know that you all have some interesting stories and questions to share. So when Steve is done introducing his book, we will be opening up the rest of the meeting for discussion and questions with him. So as you think of what you might like to say, if you are comfortable being on camera, you can use the hand raise feature at the bottom of your screen, or I believe it might be on the top if you're on a tablet or a phone. Or if you can't get that to work, you can physically raise your hand. I will be keeping track of everyone's screens. And if all else fails, our chat window will also be open as well. So you will also find that in your little bottom or top bar with the various buttons on it from Zoom. And before we get going, I would just like to share briefly for anyone who has not been to one of our programs before. My name is Sarah McDonough. I am the programs manager, and I'll be hosting tonight. Lexington Historical Society is in Lexington, Massachusetts, and we are the interpreter of all of the town's history from April 19th, 1775 through today. And I'm just going to share a brief video to let you know exactly who we are and what it is that we do.
Hello, my name is Chris Kaufman, and I'm the Education and Interpretation Manager at Lexington Historical Society. Lexington Historical Society is more than a historical society. We're storytellers, fact finders, educators, and community gatherers. Our historic house museums not only tell the stories of the past, but help us think about the world today and how we can shape the future. Every year, we welcome thousands of visitors to Lexington to learn about the first shots of the American Revolution. They come from around the world, around the country, and even right here in Massachusetts. In the community, we offer educational programs for both adults and children, including lectures, workshops, and summer camps. We work with local school districts to enhance their American history curricula so students can learn about history in an engaging way. Our recently completed Archives and Research Center offers state-of-the-art storage capabilities for our historical material, a new, safe workspace for volunteers and staff, as well as an inviting, spacious research library for residents, scholars, and students. We hope you can join us for one of our programs, whether it's in person or virtual, or possibly take a tour of one of our museums. We love having community members get involved with us and enjoy the history of Lexington. You can help keep local history alive by supporting our important mission and donating today. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone. Great. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Steve Puleo, who will be sharing some of his work with us tonight.
Thanks, Sarah. Great video, by the way. Love the work you guys do, and thrilled to be here talking to the Lexington Historical Society. I said to Sarah, I really miss the in-person events at the depot. I always found that to be such a great setting. Always found the crowd to be such a great crowd and engaged and all that. So want to try to replicate a little of that if we can virtually. I have a few things to say. I'm going to talk about the book and about this story, but as Sarah said, when we get to questions, would really like to try to do it live if we can. So I'll be able to say, you know, Thank you, Richard Paget, or thank you, Brenda Finn. Those are the names I'm seeing, for example, when we get to questions. So if we can do that, that would be fabulous, to try to at least kind of recreate that interaction that happens in a live setting to the best of our ability. So tonight, the book Voyage of Mercy, the USS Jamestown and the Irish Famine, and the remarkable story of America's first humanitarian mission, is really, I like to say, the story of two epic events. There is the Irish Famine, and when I say the Irish Famine, that's the Great Famine that begins in the summer of 1846 and pretty much goes through most of the year 1847. There had been various small famines in Ireland in the previous years. There were other famines in later years, but when we talk about the Great Famine, the Great Hunger, as the Irish called it, that's the famine that we're talking about. So it's from the Irish point of view, an amazingly sad, tragic, but epic, as I say, epic event. It is an event that really caused about 30% of the Irish population to go away. Before the famine, the Irish population was very close to 9 million people. After the famine, it's down to about 6, a little over 6. And so you had about 1.2 million or 1.3 million who die from starvation and from attendant diseases related to starvation, like dysentery and scurvy and typhus and those kinds of things. And then you have 1.5 million to 1.6 million who emigrate, the great Irish immigration, the diaspora from Ireland to a variety of places, some to England, some to the rest of Europe, some to Canada, but the vast majority to the United States. So it really changes the dynamic between Ireland and the United States, changes the dynamic between Ireland and Britain because of the British way of handling the famine, which was a terribly poor way of handling it. And so that's one side of what I call these two epic events. So think about this. There's a historian that said the Irish famine was the worst tragedy visited upon Europe since the Black Death, since the plague, and that there was not any greater decimation of people in Europe until about 100 years later during the Holocaust. So if 1/3 of the Irish population disappears, think about that. 100 years later, a little less than 100 years later, about 2/3 of European Jewry disappears, is exterminated. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of scope. There have been greater famines in terms of numbers in the 20th century, particularly in places like Africa and Asia and Russia, for sure, and other places. But just in terms of its percentage or of its scope on a country, the Irish famine, the Great Hunger, was a disaster, a real tragedy. On the other side of the ocean, there's this remarkable, this remarkable example of generosity and soaring goodwill on the part of the United States and its people. For the first time in recorded history, not just United States history, but recorded history, people of one country on a very broad scale, a very, very wide scale, help people of another country for purely altruistic and humanitarian reasons. So it's not something that was part of the geopolitical landscape back in 1846 and 1847. I mean, countries, went to war with each other. They pillaged each other's villages. They burned each other's crops. They occasionally traded with each other if the economic conditions, so dictated. But the notion of one country helping another on such a wide scale, humanitarian scale, had just never happened before. That's what's so remarkable about this story. Very remarkable when I started the research and dug into it. So the effort is begun on March 28th, 1847, with the sailing of the USS Jamestown, which is the first ship to go to Ireland, laden down with food for the people of County Cork. And it goes till about the summer of 1847. And during that time, about 150 ships, 150 ships from the United States, go to Ireland filled with food, all kinds of food stuff for the starving people of Ireland. It's one of those I kind of think of it as this story of generosity amidst this unfathomable despair. So you have these two sides of the ocean with two very, very different things going on. From the Irish side, the famine happens very, very quickly. So in the summer of 1846, it looks as though the potato crop in Ireland is going to be very abundant. And 3 weeks after, the first potato kind of blooms and blossoms. The fungus causes it to turn black and the blight begins. And the blight begins right around mid-August, late August. And by about October, November, people are already starving. The previous year had been a very, I'll say, poor potato crop, not famine, but poor crop. And so the Irish were not doing well in terms of sustenance and nutrition anyway. And when the potato blight happens in the summer of 46, it really does turn into a disaster. The British are very, very slow in responding. Lots of debate on how the British responded. Lots of historians down through the years have varied their opinion on the British response. Some have called it an outright genocide in the way that the British responded to the famine. I don't call it that. I think most historians now view it as incompetence, so kind of a combination of incompetence, indifference, ineptness, anti-Catholicism. All of that plays into the way the British respond, but they're very, very slow to respond. British at this time in the summer of 46 view the Irish as a little bit of an embarrassment, right? A backward country that relies very, very heavily on the potato. Sir Charles Trevelyan, who's the person responsible for the management of the famine on behalf of the British government, says, what hope is there for a nation which relies on potatoes? And I think it's important to know that at this point in time, about 30% of the Irish population relied exclusively on the potato. Think about that when you think about this kind of epic event. And people ask, why is that? Why were the Irish so dependent on the potato? And the answer, of course, is a simple one, but in a way, a tragic one that's born of this anti-Catholicism and this the way the British have managed the country and now the province of Ireland, which is part of the British Empire at this time. And it's basically this: the Irish tenant farmers worked land that was owned by absentee British landlords, and the British, through the years, had divided that land up into narrower and narrower strips, I guess is the most simple way to put it. And the only crop that provided enough yield to feed a family, and the Irish birth rate was rising prior to the famine, and to provide enough sustenance and nutrition was the potato. And so the potato, of course, it's not that the Irish knew this, scientifically at the time, but the potato provides numerous vitamins, numerous minerals, calories that are necessary. It's easily digestible, all of that. And so for the Irish, the potato it sustained health, it sustained vitality, it sustained their economic well-being, because you could, with extra potatoes, go sell potatoes at market and maybe buy a wagon or a horse or a pig, and it really sustained life itself. So the potato had such a strong part, both, I would say, physically and psychologically in the Irish mindset at this time. And so when the destruction happens, and the destruction happens really fast, it's devastating to the country of Ireland. When the United States gets word of how bad things are, and they get word really in January of 1847, so about 5 months or so after things start to go downhill in Ireland, the United States really swings into action quite quickly. There's initially a debate in Congress about donating about $500,000 to the Irish. President James K. Polk gets word to the Congress that he probably would not sign such a bill because he feels it would be unconstitutional to spend United States money overseas for this kind of an effort. And so the United States government response, or the United States government role, really takes on two distinct characteristics. One is they agreed to turn over 2 ships that are part of the United States Navy, to decommission the ships, to retrofit those ships and allow them under the command of civilian captains to take food to Ireland. One is the Jamestown, which is the first. The second is the USS Macedonian out of New York, which gets caught up a little bit in bureaucratic red tape and doesn't sail until June of 47. So the Jamestown becomes the first to go in that direction. And the other thing the US government did, and Congress, with senators like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, is to encourage every town, or as many towns as possible in the United States, to set up an Irish Relief Committee. And that committee would be responsible for collecting some money, yes, but more preferably collecting food that could be sent over directly to Ireland. And the United States responds in a huge way. Almost every town, city, frontier outpost in the United States sets up this Irish Relief Committee. And think about this, there are people of all religions. You might expect some of the Catholic churches would be part of this effort, but Quakers, Methodists, Presbyterians, Jews, Congregationalists, Quakers, Unitarians, every kind of religion contributes in the United States. And people from all walks of life, farmers, shopkeepers, saloon operators, blacksmiths, lawyers, children, people who were members of slave churches, congregations, orphans, prisoners at Sing Sing, all did their part to contribute something. But most Americans sent food, and they sent, wheat and barley and meal and flour and venison and pork and yes, potatoes in some cases. And it's food that they basically either grew and harvested, or hunted or fished and sent to Ireland. So when we think of contributions that people make, charitable contributions today, how do we do that? We usually donate something to a food pantry. We maybe go online and use our credit card and donate money, which is fantastic. But this is food that people generally grew or hunted for their own families. And they ended up, Americans ended up putting it in kegs, or putting it in burlap sacks, putting it on small ships that went down the Ohio River and the Erie Canal to the big ports, to New York, to Boston, to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, and to send that food to Ireland. The United States, as I said, sends about 150 ships during that period. They send them to the ports of Cork, Londonderry, Waterford, Donegal, Dublin, Galway, Limerick, all of those counties. And so it's this really incredible effort on the part of the United States. And people say, well, what happened? What is the thing that caused this? It's such an odd, it's a first, but also there was such a great amount of discrimination against the Irish when they eventually come to the United States. So what is it that caused this real groundswell of support? And I think a lot of things come together to create that. One, the United States at this point is in the midst of the Mexican War. It's just over. And particularly among Northeast progressives, particularly, there's a lot of guilt on the part of the Northeast progressives who were opposed to the Mexican War. And this was one way, I think, to assuage that guilt, to help Ireland, to help another country. Two, the United States is in the midst of a lot of reform movements during this period: the prison reform movement, the education reform movement, the mental health reform movement, the women's suffrage movement, and of course the abolitionist movement. All of it is kind of coming together around this time. And this, I think, was part and parcel of the mindset that propagated those movements. Three, we're in the midst of the second great American awakening. That's the Protestant Great Awakening, which is this revival movement that says, you have a responsibility to others beside yourselves, to help others beside yourselves. I think that's all part of it. And then 1846, remember, was called the Year of Decision in America. It's the first use of the phrase manifest destiny. And manifest destiny sometimes gets a bum rap as far as people moving across the country. But I think one of the benefits to it, or one of the positives to manifest destiny, is it taught this lesson, or it preached this lesson, the concept that the United States was a land of abundance, that it had much arable land, it had many navigable rivers, it had fish on its coastlines, and it really had an obligation to help others. That there was a sense that Americans needed to do more to help others. So I think all those factors come together to help in the midst of the worst of the famine. The famine has this long-standing legacy in Ireland, as I said, with Irish-British relations, with Irish-American relations. So I think the famine has as its bedrock legacy things like the Irish independence movement in the early 20th century. The fact that Ireland remained neutral during World War II, something that was a real consternation both to the Irish people and to people in the United States. There was some real issues because the government of Ireland remained neutral. Ireland was one of 7 countries that remained neutral during the Second World War: Switzerland, Ireland, Spain, Yemen, a couple of others. But the Irish refused Winston Churchill's request to help against the Nazis, and in fact, even become sympathetic to the Nazis during the Second World War. And that's becomes a real issue for the people of Ireland after December 7th, 1941, because now Britain's war becomes America's war. And the Irish are very friendly to the United States, have lots of sympathy to the United States. And so there's this real tension between many of the Irish people, many of the Irish who serve in the Irish Defense Force, and the Irish government. In fact, members of the Irish Defense Force, thousands of them essentially defect, if you will, and go to fight on the side of the Allies in the British Army. They are, when they get back, many of them are prosecuted. Many of them are not able to have jobs, and they're really vilified. And it's not until 2012 that they were all pardoned, all those thousands who fought on behalf of the Allies, and that is allies with the British and eventually the United States. And so you can see how long-lasting that was. And then I think the famine is the bedrock issue that leads to the troubles in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. Yes, there are huge religious implications, but it's the famine, I think, that is at the root of it all during the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And so there's an Irish historian who said in 1999 that the Great Famine has been the unseen guest at every Irish dinner table for the last 150 years. I think that's probably accurate. So I think it has that kind of long-term legacy. The British-Irish relationship today, I think, is improved. I think it starts really improving, I would say, in the early 2000s. So very, very recent. Still is not ideal, but I think is beginning to improve. And I think the famine becomes, is that piece that lasts for such a very long time. The Irish-American relationship, on the other hand, remains very, very strong. The Irish have been strong allies of the United States since the Jamestown mission and since this assistance during the famine. The Irish government is very supportive of Native American tribes in the United States, particularly because of the donations in 1847 by the Choctaw Indians, who were part of the Trail of Tears many years earlier. When they finally get to Oklahoma and learn about the Irish famine, they end up collecting $170 for the Irish and donate that to the famine relief. And the Irish Choctaw and Irish Navajo relationship since the famine has been remarkably close. In 1995, Irish President Mary Robinson became the first woman to sit on the elder council of the Choctaw tribe as a result of that. And during this last pandemic, the pandemic we're in or just finishing, the Irish contribute to both the Choctaw and the Navajo. And again, that stems from the assistance Native Americans gave to the Irish during the Great Famine. And so all of this, I think, is kind of bound up, the Irish-British relations, the Irish-American relations, and it has the famine as its root. And I think when you look at something that's this big and this epic, that it's just remarkable that the United States has kind of started this effort of world contributions and world humanitarian efforts. And for the United States, that legacy of the famine continues on. It happens during the famine of 1879 and 80, when the Irish have another famine and the United States contributes. It goes into the 20th century when the Hoover Commission, people from across the United States contribute to starving Belgians prior to the United States entrance into World War I. And so as the Germans kind of surround Belgium, the United States contributes. It's part of the contributions of the Berlin airlift that happens in 1948, when the United States people contributed tons and tons of food to the people of Berlin when the Soviet blockade occurs. It happens in 2010, when the United States sends technology and machines and equipment to help the Chilean miners who are trapped underground for a long period of time. And even domestically, this, what I would call public-private partnership that starts with the famine, continues. It happens during tragedies, hurricanes, the San Francisco earthquake, the Mississippi River flood in 1927. When you look at what the United States people contribute, I think in 2019, the United States people contributed about $130 billion in international aid. They contributed about 40% of that through their tax dollars, but about 60% of it privately, through NGOs or through charities like the Red Cross and Salvation Army, through workplace charities, those kinds of things. That too is a legacy of the Great Famine, the Great Hunger in 1846, 1847. So that's my summary. That's my kind of beginning. It's 7:30. I hit the mark, as we say in the business. I said to Sarah, it'd be great if I could wrap up my summary at 7:30, and then we can kind of open it up for discussion. So here we are, and would love to hear from you guys. Questions, just say your name, even your first name. I don't need to know your last name, but just in case I don't have it on my screen, I have most of them, but I have somebody called Bruins, by the way. So for example, I wouldn't be able to call them Bruins. I'd have to call them by their name. So if you have questions, I'd love to hear from you, or any kind of comment whatsoever, and we can get this thing going.
Yep. So for anyone who has can find any of their little reaction buttons at the bottom of the screen, that's probably the easiest to see, especially if you don't feel comfortable being on camera.
Yeah, I see Bruins with her hand up, so that's great.
So
I have a question.
Yeah.
My first name is Marion, and my husband is here too. He's Bill. And,
Okay.
And we have that infamous last name. My question is, the ships that went over to Ireland with all the food, did they come back empty, or did they didn't bring any of the immigrants with them?
Yeah, outstanding question. Did you say Marion? So I got that right?
Yep.
Yeah, so Marion, outstanding question. And the answer is they mostly did come back empty or with ballast to help them sail. But Robert Bennett Forbes, who's the captain of the Jamestown, sets the tone very early and says, we are not equipped to take starving immigrants back. He had very much a ragtag crew. Most of the experienced sailors that time were already involved at the Battle of Veracruz during the Mexican War. He puts together an inexperienced crew. He said, we're not experienced to take back these, we're not experienced to take back these immigrants. And so they would not be coming back. And there were regular Irish, as they called them, famine ships at the time that departed Ireland, that departed Liverpool, England, etc. About 5,000 of them, by the way, that took immigrants out of Ireland. But most of these ships that brought money did not take people back. Occasionally there'd be a stowaway, but for the most part, it was the policy to bring the food and then to come back. Excellent question.
Can I ask you another question?
You may.
When we think about humanitarian actions, and I think about the ships carrying Jewish people during World War II and how our government would not even let them land. And that's the opposite. So is it the difference between government and the ordinary citizen, or what?
Yeah, so I think there's a little of that. I think during the, I'm glad, it's interesting you brought up the, because I was just reading the other day a little more about the St. Louis, which of course is the classic ship in 1939 that sails the ocean. It's supposed to land in Cuba, and then it tries to land in Florida, and the United States essentially can't or doesn't take any more refugees. There were, thousands of refugees, Jewish refugees that did come into the country prior. Roosevelt has this real struggle, do we bring in more Jews? Is that going to be a concern? There's this real strong isolationist policy in the United States prior to Pearl Harbor, as you probably know. How much do we get involved economically? He's trying to sell the Lend-Lease program to the British, to provide materiel to the British and to the Russians at the time. He's balancing that. So I think, I think in hindsight, you could have made the argument that Roosevelt could have taken more. But I think at the time, I feel like he's trying to juggle a lot of different factors. And tragically, and I don't think we know the scope of what's happening in Germany till about late 42 or early 43, because of course the whole extermination final solution is not finalized until about January of 42 at the 1C conference. And so in those earlier years, those 39, 40, 41 years, when Jews could have escaped, early 41, could have escaped, I think that's the same time the United States is trying to figure out what they're going to do here. Churchill's dying for the United States to get into the war. Roosevelt thinks it's probably the right thing to do, but it's about 65-35 in the United States not to go into a European war. So I think all those factors come in, Marion, and that's what happens. And as you know, that happens in history sometimes. Lots of different factors that in the moment look one way and then in hindsight look another, Yeah. Great questions, Marion.
Hi, my name is Bill Flynn.
Hey,
I'm
Bill.
100% Irish. My wife over here is 100% Italian. She liked your book on the molasses.
What a
flood.
combination. What a combination. My wife's 100% Irish too. So excellent.
Good for you. I hope you like meatballs. She likes them. Anyway,
I do.
I've spent a lot of time reading about Irish history written by both British journalists and historians, and of course, Irish historians. And I think it's, prescinding from, emotion and all this kind of religious stuff, it's pretty clear that there were problems that went back centuries between the British and the Irish. And the famine was, where it came to a head. But over many centuries, the British had really repressed the Irish, probably largely because of their religion and the fact that the Irish wanted nothing to do with the Church of England. And at one point, there was something called the Ulster Plantation, where the Irish came in and took away the land. The British took away the lands of a lot of Irish in most of Ireland and just gave it to Scottish Presbyterians or English people. And then the Irish became tenants on their own lands. And when the famine came, these people were having to pay rent to absentee landlords. Half the time they never saw them, for use of their own land. And they were still required to pay rent. So if any of them had other things like other fruits that they were growing or whatever, they had to sell them in order to pay their rent. But this was just one symptom of things that have been going on for centuries. And
So
it's wonderful what has happened in the last 20 years. And, politicians like Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and Senator Mitchell from Maine all got involved just to get people's heads together and say, look, you've got to stop this. And even fanatic people like Jerry Adams finally threw in the towel and joined the fray. And they've put it all behind them. And it's, we just hope it sticks.
Yeah, so you said a lot. So let me try to get some of it. Let me just try to comment on some of it. So you're absolutely right about the British response to the Irish, let's take it from 1695 with the penal codes and when William of Orange gets on the throne. But you're absolutely right. That anti-Catholic sentiment is very, very strong from then, when the Irish couldn't own land, they couldn't vote, they couldn't go to school. Catholics couldn't own land, all of that. So I think you're absolutely right. But I think the famine becomes such a massive issue because people begin to die in such large numbers. And you're absolutely right. I mean, in the midst of all of that, in the midst of that starvation, the Irish tenant farmers are required to pay rent. And of course, many of them can't as a result of it. And that's when thousands of evictions happen across the country in the midst of this famine, in the midst of one of the worst winters in Irish history, which is the winter, November, December of 1846, January, February, March of 1847. Terrible snow, terribly cold temperatures and wind, and the Irish are being evicted by the thousands because they can't, they can't pay their rent. And so one of the things that I think is seared in Irish memory is thousands of Irish wandering the countryside who have been evicted, and the British who are still exporting other kinds of grains from Ireland because they don't want to disrupt the corn markets. So you had wagons full of grain going by these Irish, guarded by British troops. It's one of the searing memories, in Irish history. And the word eviction becomes a dirty word for the Irish, both in Ireland and when they come to the United States. That word eviction is a fearful word for the Irish. So I think you're right, that there were things, for a couple hundred years beforehand, but I think it's the famine that really, as you say, brings things to a head. And you're right, in the last, I think that's what I said at the beginning, since 2000, the early 2000s, things have improved. But I will tell you, not totally. I was in Ireland in 2009, and we had rented sort of a big van to tour Ireland, and then we went up to Northern Ireland to Belfast, etc. And we came out of our hotel, and our van driver was next to the van. He was furious, and they had broken his side mirror window. And he said, it's because we have license plates from the south of Ireland, and every time I come up here, I have some kind of an issue. So just a little anecdotal thing. Still not perfect, but I think you're right. I think they're, with a guy like Adams, as you say, throws in the towel, tremendous violence, lots of civilians killed during the Troubles, including children, I think finally brings this thing to a head. You're right.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill. I see you. Bill Poole?
Hi, yes.
Hey, Bill.
How are you? Thank you very much. It's wonderful. I wanted to expand a little bit on Bill's comment about the anti-Catholicism. Certainly the Know Nothing movement that arose here in the United States had a great deal to do with the Irish immigration. And it was wonderful if you read the papers, the newspapers of those times. Protestant Germans were okay. Catholic Germans were not okay.
Yeah, it's true.
And the Irish being, in essence, all Catholic, this movement arose out of it, which has lasted in this country. It lasted right well into the 20th century with regard to areas of the country and anti-Catholicism. The other aspect of this is, in my family, one brother came over, and then 3 other brothers came over with his support. What it brought was a tremendous migration afterwards. They didn't come over until 1866.
Right.
But there was a continuous migration thereafter from the famine all the way on. And that's what gave a tremendous impetus towards the Irish becoming a community of their own and eventually getting political power.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think you're right, Bill, on all counts. Thank you. When you look at the transformation that happens in Boston, you're absolutely correct. So great fears of the Irish Catholics, great fears of popery and rum and Rome and all of that. That was one of the sayings as part of when the Irish came over here. So if you look at the kind of great migration, it's from about 1847 till about 1860, that famine-related migration, right up to the Civil War. Like that's
Yeah.
a way to look at it. By 1885, Boston is largely an Irish city. You know, it's got an Irish congressman. It's got its first Irish mayor. It's a remarkable transformation that happens. And you're right, one of the things that the Irish do, for example, that the Italians don't do, is the Irish realize very quickly that banding together, regardless of what county you came from, but banding together to vote as a bloc was extremely powerful. The Italians don't do that. They have very strong loyalties to their regions, to to Sicily, to Calabria, to Avellino, whatever. But when they come here, they don't band together in a very strong way. There is never really an Italian vote the way there was an Irish vote in Boston, for example. When I told people that the first Italian American mayor of Boston wasn't elected till 1993, Tom Menino, people from other parts of the country are like, you're kidding. With all those Italians, how's that even possible? And that is one of the ways that's possible. So you're right, they realize it, they kind of realize that very quickly. But then you're also right, after the Civil War, and of course, let's all be clear about this, the Irish fight very, very bravely for the Union in the Civil War. There are remarkably brave and accomplished Irish regiments during the Civil War. So there's that little break during the Civil War where there's not much emigration from Ireland or immigration to the United States. But then you're right, it picks up again 1866-ish and continues for a long time. So yeah, excellent point. Good job, you guys. What else? Don't be shy.
Have you given any talks in Ireland about this, or obviously not?
Not in
physically,
Ireland,
but
unfortunately. Haven't been able to get over there in the last year, but lots of Zoom events where people have jumped on from Ireland, from England, from other countries, and from lots of different states. That's been sort of interesting during this whole Zoom phenomenon that I've had. I had an event where I had about 500 people on, and I think we had people from 11 states and 3 different countries, which is really interesting. As much as I miss live events, and I miss them a lot, that's been one of the small pluses, I think, in this Zoom thing, is that people from all over the country or from different parts of the world can jump on if they want to. So that's been really interesting for sure.
Can I talk?
One interesting thing about the Irish diaspora is that once they got out of there, they did very well everywhere they went. It was an intelligent, hardworking, family-oriented lot. And when they came to the U.S. or other places like Australia, and even some in South Africa, they just dug in and got the next couple of generations educated. And before you know it, they were running the place. Like, as you said, they knew the language and they knew how to stay together, and they understood the significance of democratic voting machine. And next thing you know, they're running the place here and in other places. They just weren't able to do that in Ireland. They were constrained by space and also the other restrictions put on them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if you look at the contributions of the Irish to the United States, one of the things, so I always look at least in the Boston area and some of the other big eastern cities, northeast cities. So if you look at some of the big migration groups, Irish, Italians, Jews, if you look at the Irish, one of the things the Irish do, I think, at least from the Italian perspective, the Italians face a lot of discrimination when they come here. But one piece of discrimination they really don't face is the anti-Catholic discrimination. The Irish kind of they kind of plow that roadblock down. Now, what the Italians do face is a lot of discrimination for the then Irish Catholic Church from that church. So, but as far as what I would call kind of nativist anti-Catholicism, the Irish kind of, are the leaders in breaking that down. And then the Italians pick up, and they have other kinds of discrimination, but they don't have that. And so I find that whole concept kind of interesting. I just think that Catholic piece, and you said it, Bill, I think earlier with the British, the British always said that the Irish relied too much on their religion and too much on potatoes. Those were the two things. And
alcohol.
well, yeah, Teresa, that don't be saying that to your husband. That's but no, too much on the potato and too much on religion. The British were a little bit embarrassed Ireland at this time because of those two things. Because 1846, 1847, think about this, it's the Industrial Revolution in England, in London. And so they view the Irish as very backward, never saying, of course, that they were part of the reason for the Irish backwardness. But the religious piece, they always felt the Irish relied too much. One of the great quotes I have is that, somebody in Britain, one of the British Parliament members, I think, said, an Irishman would take the bread out of the mouth of a living child to pay for a mass, to commemorate the death of a loved one, of a dead child. And so that was one of the comments that one of these British Parliament members made. And so there's lots of that during this famine discussion, and even a little bit after the famine discussion. So I found that whole anti-Catholicism piece so interesting. And that World War II piece even interests me more, is that whole dynamic between the Irish not wanting to fight with the British against the Nazis, and how that pained so many of them after the United States gets into the war. Those two things were some of the more fascinating parts of the research.
That was De Valera's decision.
Yes, it was. Oh, yes. Yep.
There's a guy named Pat Coogan who has written biographies of all those guys, including De Valera, and I think he found the dispatch from Churchill that said that. I have his biography of De Valera, and he has a picture of it. And I think he's the one that discovered it.
Yeah, I think he was. And I mean, De Valera, had Nazis on the streets of Dublin as late as 1944, 1945, who had left Germany. And so, yeah, that becomes such a flashpoint, I would say, between the Irish in their own government, because most, at least the people in the Irish Defense Force, and there's thousands of them that defect and that decide to go fight with the British Army and with the Allies. They're really, really disappointed and distraught that they're not on the side of the United States, even more so than England, after Pearl Harbor.
The British, England, they've contributed so much to culture and elegance and literature and everything over the centuries, and much of what this country is came from British. But a problem that the British have had historically is that when they take over a place and make it as part of the empire, they don't want to blend in and mix in and intermarry. They want to dominate and rule. Ireland got invaded by the French, the Danes, the Vikings, and after they all finished beating each other up, all those folks just kind of blended in and became part of the race. And the British never did that in Ireland or anywhere else. They just wanted to rule and dominate and look down upon these peasants that they were ruling. And that attitude is reflected in what you were saying.
I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah.
Bill?
Yeah,
Bill.
With regard to the famine itself, was it even all the way throughout Ireland? Did the West Country get hit later than the East? And I was very interested with regard to, you said that there were succeeding famines through time, yep, and that might have brought about further waves of immigration.
Yeah, so I would say the West gets hit a little later. The South, Cork gets hit the hardest and very early. The entire county is really, really devastated. So that's the answer to that. And yes, there were preceding famines. I mean, if you look, I think it's 1840, 41, 42, 45, terrible potato crops. But then there's a really big famine in 1879 and 80, when the United States, by the way, sends another decommissioned warship to Ireland with food. And so, it's 30 years later or so, and the Irish, I think, are still struggling to figure out what to do beyond the potato. It takes a long time, as you guys know, and there's lots of reasons for that. I think, it's a country, keep this in mind, that has almost no system of internal roads.
Yeah.
Or internal rivers. One of the things that the United States has is these great navigable network of rivers, that can move goods to the interior, which is the key. The Irish didn't have that, and I think it took a long time for them to develop some kind of a reasonable economy, So
Some of us who have driven in Ireland a few years ago would say they hadn't improved that much, but I forgive me, because now the highways are getting very, very good there.
yeah, no, I think, it's finally getting to that point. But that was one of the problems with some of the food that came from the United States as the ships pulled into these different ports. I mean, basically what happened is word went out to the interior to come down and get your food. And so they would send down groups of 10 or 20 men to bring the food, by wagon, by cart, drag it back to the interior, because there was no good road system. Which, by the way, I will say this, the British eventually opened soup kitchens. They're very late to the game, March, April of 47, very late to the game. But eventually, by the summer of 47, the British are feeding about 3 million people with their soup kitchens, which is a remarkable number of people for a country with no internal road system. So yes, that, and of course the British point to that as their positive response to the famine, but it just happens too late. There's a lot of dithering, a lot of bureaucratic, box checking, make sure all the forms are checked off, in kind of true British bureaucratic fashion at the time, and not much food getting to the Irish. So when it finally
nothing like
does
that
happen,
happens with us today, does it?
what's that?
Nothing like that happens with us today.
Well, I mean, I think it does happen occasionally, but when you think about,
well, I'm talking about the dithering with the COVID and so forth.
there's still a lot of dithering. Yeah,
Yeah.
there is that. I guess. But it's funny when you talk about that. Even during this pandemic, I think it's sort of interesting. What's the first thing people did? They contributed food to food pantries. They brought food to like hospital workers and first responders. They contributed money to restaurants to keep them alive during the. So it's always about the food, right? It always comes back to the food being the priority. I think no question about it. If you look at 1847, if you look at 2020, 21, yeah.
But it takes a government interested and responsible and effective to bring that about, both during the latter part of the famine and also today, that unless you, because it needs to be, I hate to say the word centralized, but at least organized.
Yeah, I think so.
It struck me how inevitable it all seemed.
Yeah.
Similarly, to this past year, even at the beginning of the book, where there were, I think you said there was some confusion because there had been other potato crop failures, and people thought, well, didn't we just give you people food? What's going on? Is this happening again? Do you really need it, or are we being scammed? And you would think that if the government had just been a little bit more proactive, rather than waiting for an hugely impoverished nation to somehow sort themselves out, that none of this would have happened.
Sure, but again, I always, Sarah, I always tell when I teach my college, I teach a World War II class at UMass Boston, and one of the things I always tell the kids, and I tell anyone who looks at history, is always put yourself in the moment, right? So the earlier discussion that we had with Marion about the Jewish question, right? So in hindsight, I always think the Holocaust is a good example. In hindsight, should we have accepted more Jewish refugees? Yes. Should we have bombed the railroad lines in 1944 on the way to the extermination camps? Maybe. But in the moment, what's going on is you're having, and again, I'm not making excuses for anybody. I always just try to put myself in the moment. In the moment, you have Roosevelt and you have George Marshall saying, no, the quickest way to save as many Jews as possible is to end this war. So if we start diverting resources to bombing railroad lines, that's going to be a problem. Let's end this war. That's the quickest way to do it. Do they know the scope of the situation? They know it's bad by late 44, I would say, but I still don't know they know the scope, the full scope of it, until those camps start to be liberated in early 45. So I just always caution against what I call, and this is, I'm not, Sarah, this doesn't mean you, but I always call it the arrogance of presentism, which is, we know how to do it. Why didn't they do it the way we would have done it? And I'm just saying that history is always great with 20/20 hindsight, and but that's not how it works, you know? So
it's always struck me years ago. I watched a documentary about the Salem witch trials, and there were a number of historians saying there's always this assumption that if only I had been there,
yes,
I would have been the only one who saw through it, and I would have told everyone exactly what to do with my 21st century knowledge. But
yes, no, I think that's right. You know, I have to sometimes remind my students, like, hey, there were no, D-Day was carried out without a text, without Instagram, without Facebook, without fax machines. Like, you have to kind of set them, even college students, you have to kind of set them in the moment to say, oh, okay, that's how that happened. That's why the French resistance was walking around with messages in their shoes, because they couldn't text that, here's the plane coming from Britain with supplies or something like that. It's always kind of interesting.
That is a good point. With the infrastructure being what little it was back then, what was the mail system like in Ireland? How did people find out that this was happening? Yeah,
so again, good questions. A lot of people found out it was happening literally from wandering Irishmen around the street. I mean, you have to picture thousands of Irishmen wandering from little village to little hamlet, trying to find food, trying to find some kind of work, trying to find some kind of housing. So a lot of it was by that. The British newspapers that circulated in Ireland, and even some of the Irish newspapers, eventually picked stuff up. Even the London Times, which is totally anti-Irish during this time, have stories, that eventually reach the Irish. But no, it takes time for it to get across the country. But so when that kind of word of mouth, when the Irish would be wandering the countryside, word get around fast. It's not a large country, it's big. It's not that large. So that kind of thing would be able to happen. And as I said, some of the Irish papers, but again, there was a lot of skepticism. You think sometimes we have skepticism with media today. There's always been skepticism with media. So you would read people knew in the 1840s and the early 1850s that the London Times had one point of view. Punch, the satirical magazine, had another point of view, and so that they were kind of aware of that as well. So you're right. I think accurate information was hard to come by, but most of it was circulated by word of mouth.
We have a British son-in-law that surprisingly is.
I can't hear that. Is that my fault or?
No, it's ours, I think. I said we have a British son-in-law who acknowledges how badly the British treated the Irish, which we wouldn't expect, but he's really embarrassed by it.
Oh, sure. I think there's no doubt about that. I think it's undebatable that the British handled this in a horrible fashion.
Yeah.
As I said, I have had plenty of people ask me if I thought it was a genocide. I don't. I mean, the word genocide, as you guys probably know, literally is invented in 1948 as a result of the extermination of the Jews. And there's kind of a UN definition that is the deliberate and systematic eradication state-sponsored eradication or attempted eradication of a people based on religion or race. And so if you use that definition, I don't think that's the case here. As I said, I think the British were indifferent, incompetent, inept, impotent, figure the imp word you want, and anti-Catholic. Yes, I think all of that is true. And that leads to this very, very, very slow and ineffective response. I would say, and I think you could say, almost unforgivable response, but not a genocide in my view.
Well, your students at UMass Boston are very lucky to have you. I bet your classes are fascinating. You have a way of getting your audience going.
Bill, will you come in and tell them that? No, I'm kidding. Thank you.
Is your next book World War II?
What's that?
Is your next book going to be on World War II?
It is not, but there is a book 8. I can do that little commercial. Puglio book 8 will be coming. I'm in the middle of doing, just starting the writing now after lots of research, and I can't tell you the topic, but very excited about it. Signed my deal in the midst of this pandemic, so that's always a blessing. And yeah, looking forward to doing the work.
I thought you were teaching World War II that you were going to be doing World War, writing about it, no?
Well, that would be an option that would be incorrect.
Okay. I told my book club that's what I thought it was going to be.
All right, well, that's good. Listen, keep the interest going.
Yeah, I'll give the plug. If you're not on Steve's mailing list already, you should be, because he always has good information, and you'll be the first to know when the subject and the title comes out.
Yeah, and I can say I'm happy. My email address is spuglio@aol.com. If you want to shoot me a note and say, please put me on the mailing list, happy to do that. I do maybe 3 or 4 mailings a year. I'm not going to inundate you every day with a Puglio mailing, but I will be doing one probably end of May, to just give you an update on, the Puglio author life as we head into the summer. So feel free, just shoot me a note, say I'd love to be on your mailing list, and I'll get you on. You'll be among the first several thousand people to know what the book 8 topic is.
You have had such a variety of books.
Yes.
How do you come up with the new title? Is just it falls from the sky, or do you think about it beforehand?
No, I think about it a lot.
Go?
Yeah, no, I think about it a lot. I always say, I like a story. First of all, it's all about story with me. I try to make history as interesting as possible, as compelling as possible in kind of a story form. So it's got to be a good story. There has to be strong characters, real life characters. There has to be an event or events that have a big picture context as well. And there has to be good primary sources. I use primary sources, for all of my books. And so I want to make sure there's enough of those to get through the story. So I try to put all of those together. And if it's the kind of thing that a lot of people haven't written about before, that's even better. So that's what I try to do.
I actually wrote to you about my mother was brought up in the North End, right near the
molasses plant.
Molasses.
Oh,
She never
okay.
told me about it.
Awesome. Yeah, I
So
tend to get.
learned it from you.
What's that?
I said she never told us about it, so I had to learn it from you.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. My dad's family grew up in the North End. Now, he was the baby of 10, so he wasn't born until 1925, but several of his older siblings were, during the 1919 flood, were there, but never really talked about it. He had never even heard of it.
Yeah.
Until I started researching Dark Tide. So, yeah, isn't that funny?
My mother talked about the Spanish flu.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a huge
Not the
topic.
time. Yeah.
Yep.
What street did he grow up? What was he born on?
He lived on Garden Court Street till he was 12, and then
Oh.
the family moved to North Street, which is a big move. Even though it's about a minute and a half from, they were about a minute and a half from each other. It was a big move because they had a bathroom inside the apartment with the move to North Street. So that was a big deal at
Oh,
the time.
okay. Yeah, I
So,
remember
Steve,
the change.
Yes,
my great-great-grandfather built 2 houses on Garden Court Street.
really?
Yep, he built
Well,
the one
that's,
that Honey Fitz lived in.
yeah. And of course, Rose Kennedy was born on Garden
Yes,
Court Street.
right, and he
Yes.
lived next door. My
Yeah.
grandmother was born there.
When I do North End tours, I do a lot of North End tours. And when I do the North End tours, I always say Garden Court Street gives you a really good sense of the different layers of North End history and Boston history. So
Uh-huh.
it's also the street on which Governor Thomas Hutchinson's mansion was located when it was burned in 1767 during the Stamp Act riots.
Huh.
Rose Kennedy's birthplace is there, which is the Irish kind of story in the North End. And then my dad's birthplace is there, which is the Italian story. So the only house without a plaque is my dad's, but what are you gonna do?
Check your inbox. I just sent you an email from my AOL account to get on your mailing list.
Yeah, I'll do that as soon as we're done here. That'll be good.
Very, very interesting and stimulating. Thank you very much. You're very
Thanks,
thoughtful.
Bill. Thank you. Much appreciated.
He can thank me because I got your book for the book club and I said, you'll love this one. You got to read it.
She screens,
Oh.
she screens the book for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, guys.
Your 2 books made the cut.
So I'm actually in Teresa's book club, but I don't know your other books. What are they?
So I have 7 books. My first book is Dark Tide. My second book is called Due to Enemy Action, which is a World War II story about the last American warship that was sunk off the coast of Maine by a German U-boat, and the Navy cover-up that happened over the next 60 years until it was finally reversed in 2002. My third book is The Boston Italians, which is a 1-volume history of the Italians in Boston, my heritage. Fourth book is A City So Grand, which is a look at Boston history from 1850 to 1900. When Boston kind of grows from what I would call a large town to a world-class city, and everything that happens in between, the arrival of the Irish, the filling of the Back Bay, all of that. So I think that's worth reading. I have a book called The Caning, which is the story of Charles Sumner's caning on the floor of the United States Senate that kind of propels the country to civil war. A book called American Treasures, which is the saving of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and Gettysburg Address, as well as thousands of other documents during the Second World War, when documents are moved out of the Library of Congress, some to Fort Knox and some to other places because of fears of a German attack or sabotage. And then Voyage of Mercy, which is the 7th book that we talked about tonight. So Stephen Puleo, Stephen with a PH, stephenpuleo.com. You can find out a lot about all of the books and me and all of that. So
That was wonderful. All right,
Thanks.
any other comments from the crowd? We're getting rounds of applause. That's great.
thank you, guys. That's awesome. Appreciate it.
Well, I
Okay.
can't wait to see what's coming next.
Sounds
Well,
good,
we
Sarah.
know.
I'm thinking probably either towards the end of the year or the beginning of 22, you'll know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So why can't you tell what the topic is?
A couple of reasons. One is, I sort of have my own little, I don't want to reveal the topic. It's kind of a jinx thing. 2 is my publisher doesn't like me to kind of announce it too soon,
I see.
You can't copyright an idea, and we don't want anyone else working on this, so it's that. It's kind of that. Those are the 2 reasons. The Puglio superstition and the publishers.
You
You
mean
know,
the
why don't you-
Italian
what-
superstition?
What's that?
The Italian superstition.
No, I don't know about that, but call it that if you want.
It was great to get another perspective as well. Of course, the Irish experience is intertwined with the Italian experience
It
in
really is.
Boston. So I'm sure you have, after this research, a million ideas pinging around in your head.
Yeah, it's funny. I did a good amount of research on the Irish for A City So Grand, for their arrival here. But I really dug into it a lot for this book. And I married into a large Irish family, so that was a little bit behind this too, and I had done the Italians. I've done enormous research on the Italians, and so it was good to the two biggest Boston immigrant groups. I feel like I've done a lot of research on both, so that's been good.
Great.
Well, thanks again. That was outstanding. Appreciate your time.
Thank you guys. You guys were outstanding too. I really appreciate that. Can't wait to get back to the depot.
Yeah.
That'll be wonderful. We'll have to come up with some other excuse, because I don't think we can wait until 2023 to see you again.
Yeah, that's fine. We'll figure something out, Sarah. We can make that happen.
Yeah, and in case anyone is interested, on Tuesday we are going to be having our last book club of the spring, which is free and open to everyone. And I think we're going to be reading a book that you recommended in your last newsletter, The Splendid and the Vile.
Oh,
So
good.
we're very excited about that.
Yeah, good book. Larson's good, really good. I think this is the best Larson book since Isaac Storm, maybe, or Devil in the White City. Those are both his, and he does a great job with basically England standing alone in 1940. And Churchill's response and all that. So yeah, sort of interesting, because that's around the time Churchill asked the Irish to get involved too. So you guys can be thinking about that when you're reading The Splendid and the Vile. Yeah.
Great. Well, we hope you can all join us if you have read the book, or even if you have not read the book. The last one of the season is always free. When we do them via Zoom, hopefully we won't have to do that again, but when we do, they're $5, and it costs a bit more in person, but that is because we get a lovely catered dinner from Nelios. So we're looking forward to having dinner with all of you again very, very soon.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right, well, so we'll let you go, Steve. Thank you so much
Yes.
for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh.